Okay, let's share that. So hopefully now you can see my screen and
Yep.
we can get going. So um welcome to this of the oh, someone else has come in the waiting room. Just let them in. Um Welcome to this edition of the Data Protection Forum. As you know, we meet fortnightly at 9 o'clock now on a Wednesday morning. We used to meet Wednesday afternoons. We've now moved it to Wednesday mornings. We did have a bit of a prolonged break over Christmas, but we are now back every fortnight. And in the weeks in between, don't forget that we also have our newsletter. So if you've not signed up to our newsletter on LinkedIn, please do that. So today we're going to talk about your 30-day GDPR blueprint, turning data mayhem into business confidence. And GDPR can feel a bit overwhelming, but it can actually um, get there in 30 days. I know some people will say you can't do that, you can't do it in 30 days, but you can for most businesses. It is achievable in 30 days. It is hard work to do it in 30 days. You do need to dedicate time to it, but you can do it. And I'm going to guide you through the step-by-step blueprint that we use, broken down into 4 weeks, which makes GDPR compliance and manageable and practical. So, hey, let's get started. Um, so what we're going to cover is the 4 weeks, and I break the procedures for the 4 weeks down into these. Week one is discovery and assessing what you have, because you can't um, you can't improve the protection of what you have if you don't know what you have. So that discovery stage is so important. Then week two, we look at now we know what we've got. Then how do we secure it? How do we protect it? Week three, concentrating more on compliance and documentation. And then week four, monitoring and maintaining it. And that's so important because GDPR is an everyday thing. It's not a one-off task. You don't do it and say, right, I've done my GDPR. Don't need to worry about that anymore. It doesn't work like that. You have to do it and keep doing it. And be aware as well of things that are changing in this space. And that's another reason for subscribing to our newsletter. And then we're going to have some key takeaways, and then we should have time at the end for a few questions and answers, hopefully. So, week one. So, when you start this 30-day process, discover and assess. So, this is discovering the data that you have. So, in week one, we focus on discovery because you can't protect what you don't know. So, start by identifying what personal data you collect. So that might be customer details, it might be employee records, it might be email lists, all sorts of different information. We're not so worried at this stage about what fields of information you collect, but just what type of information do you collect. And once you know that, once you've got that, then map where that data flows. Who has access to it? Where's it stored? How is it processed? If it's something like payroll, who do you outsource that to? Have you checked that they're GDPR compliant? Because that's so important too. If you're using your accountant to do your payroll, is your accountant GDPR compliant? If you don't know, have you ever asked them? Um, and asking them is not as simple as saying, "Can I see a copy of your ICO certificate?" Because frankly, anyone can register on well, everyone should be registered with the ICO, but anyone can register on the ICO and get their certificate. That's fine. It doesn't actually prove anything other than you registered with the ICO. Um, get them to show you some of their procedures. Get them to prove that they practice what they preach and that they are looking after your data. Ask to see their ROPA registered, their Register of Processing Activities, now Article 30 register, as it's known in GDPR parlance. But ask to see it. If they haven't got it, then that's probably a good clue that they haven't done this stage. So you map where the data flows, and then once you've mapped where the data flows, you then need to look at the risks to that data. So, where are the risks and what existing security measures do you have? And it's sometimes when you come to this point, and you do have to be totally honest with yourself at this point, because if you're not honest, the only person you're fooling is yourself, um, about what the risks are. I recently worked with a client who we were talking about payroll actually, and I said to them, what do you do with your payroll then? Well, we send the details over to our payroll bureau in a spreadsheet. Okay. How do you send that then? We send it attached to an email. Okay. Do you password protect that spreadsheet? No. Okay. So you send an Excel spreadsheet. It's open to anybody via email. Is the email at least secure? Don't know. Yeah. And suddenly there's all these alarm bells ringing of what's happening with this data. And typically, if you find that in one place in the business with how the data's been handled, then you'll find it all over because things become the working norm. And that's why we're all about changing that around, because one of my mantras is that GDPR done right is a mindset, not a rule set. So, here we're looking to see where the holes in your mindset are. Understand GDPR roles and responsibilities. Who within your business is responsible for GDPR compliance? It should be a responsible person. Different people have different views on what that responsible person should be, but it should be a responsible person. But a big thing I would say is, unless you're in a situation determined by the regulations that you actually need a data protection officer, a DPO, whoever that person is responsible for your GDPR compliance, don't call them your DPO, because that actually has some legal implications. Call them your data manager, call them your data processing manager if you want, but don't call them your DPO. So once you've gone through all this and you perform a gap analysis, you look at where the holes are, where the issues are, then week one is heavy going. There's no doubt about it. You've got to put aside a lot of time in week one if you're going to do this for most businesses. But the end result is you know what you need to improve on. You know where the holes are, and you know what you're not doing. Because knowing what you're not doing is as important as knowing what you are doing. So then in week two, we move on to secure and protect that data that we now discovered we've got. So week two is all about protection. You know where the data is. Now it's time to secure it. And what does that mean? It means thinking about things like passwords. Strengthen your passwords. But again, I always say with passwords, be careful, because if you make password rules that are too complex, people will write their password on a post-it note and stick it on the corner of their screen, which kind of removes the point. A customer anecdote that I always remind myself of here is, I went to one organisation. I said this, and we were doing some training. I said about this thing. I'm not putting it on the corner of the screen. And this lady looked at me very, very studiously and said, "Oh, that's fine. We know not to do that." Okay, great. You know not to do that. But you've got quite a complex password regime. So what do you do instead then? Oh, we got a book with everybody's password in it. And if someone forgets their password, they can just look it up in the book. Yeah, that book sort of, yeah. All right, it's a little bit better than a post-it note, but still a bit weak. So do think about it, but do make people use strong passwords, and especially these days, make people use multi-factor authentication. Make people have it so that your sign-in process also sends a code to their mobile phone, or they use a device, or whatever. Or if you've got it on your keyboard, use a fingerprint. That's great, but not everybody has that. But use some form of two-factor authentication. But as part of that, though, okay, you're governing who's coming in, but also review who has access to what. Do your staff, do your team only have access to the information they need? Because, if I'm a manager in your organisation, if I'm a line manager in your organisation, yes, I have a need to see the staff records of the staff who are under me, possibly. I don't need to see, if I'm in accounts, I don't need to see the staff records of Joe who works in packaging. So again, it's about locking it down and thinking about how the minimum number of people, the less people who can see something, the safer it's going to be. And again, think about your third parties who are accessing the data. What do they do about that? Make sure you're training your staff on GDPR awareness. And as I say, ensure that your third-party processes are GDPR compliant. And so by the end of week 2, we've not only identified what data we have, we've also looked at how we're going to keep that data secure. Now, I've concentrated here for the last couple of minutes on electronic data, data held on computer. Don't forget, never forget, that GDPR applies just as much to paper records too. So if you've got paper records, how do you keep them secure? Again, I was at a time not so long ago, and I was sitting talking to this guy in his office, and I noticed that his staff kept coming into his room, going into a cupboard that was like built into the wall behind where he was. And I said, "What do you keep in there then?" "Oh, that's where we keep details of all our orders." And it was a B2C organisation, business to consumer organisation. That's where we keep all our orders. So I was like, okay, all our customer details. Okay. I said, "Do you keep it secure?" "Oh yeah, there's a lock on the door." I said, but no one seems to be using the lock." "Oh, they do, but the key, we always just leave the key in the lock because that's easiest." And it's like, well, that's not secure then, is it? And I said, "What do you do when you go home at night? Do you take the key out?" "Oh no. We do lock the door, but we leave the key in it." And it's like, sometimes, and you can sense that sometimes if somebody's saying things like that, they realise the hole in what they're saying, or hopefully they do. But they don't occur to them because that's normality. That's what they do every day. And so you do have to take this sort of slightly forensic approach to security. So week 3 then, start week 3. So now we've worked out what data we have. We've worked out what we're doing with it. We've worked out how we're keeping it secure. Now it's about proving that we do. It's about compliance and documentation. Because in my experience of now dealing with GDPR for well over 100 organisations, by far the majority of those organisations actually do things right, or 90% of things right already. They just don't realise that they are. And if they do realise that they are, they haven't actually documented it. And documentation is really important. So, first thing is your privacy policy or your privacy notice, where you can, if you put, I think it's fair to say if you put 2 GDPR specialists in a room, you'd come out with four reasons why it should be called a privacy policy or privacy notice. Personally, I don't care. I don't actually care whether you call it a privacy policy or privacy notice. What I do care is you got one. The privacy policy or notice should clearly state what data you collect and why. And also, it should set out what your lawful basis for processing that data is. And lawful basis is so important. So many people get hung up on consent. They think we don't have consent for everything. No, you don't. There's 6 legal bases. You don't need to have consent for everything. You might have a contract. If you have a contract, you don't need consent. You got a contract. You might have a legal obligation to hold the information. You might have a public task to hold the information. You might have vital interests to hold the information. Or, probably the most common one, is you might have a legitimate interest to hold the information. A legitimate interest is where it's in your business, interest of your business and your business continuity that you hold that data. But if you're relying on legitimate interest, then you should carry out something that's called a data privacy impact assessment, which sets out what data it is and why you're relying on legitimate interest. And then you should carry out what's called the balancing test. And the balancing test is basically saying, is the risk to that personal data higher, then the benefit to the business. And if the risk is higher, then either you need to look at ways of mitigating that risk, or you'll not be doing that process, whatever it is that you were doing on it. And sometimes that balancing test can be tricky, even for professionals like myself. It can sometimes take a lot of thinking about as to where that balancing test comes. But no, you do need to do that. You need to establish a lawful basis. You need to make sure that you can fulfill data subjects' rights, because data subject has the right to know what information you're holding about them. They have the right to know what you're processing it for, how you're processing it. They have the right to object to that processing, and they have the right ultimately to ask you to delete the data. But there's all sorts of reasons why you might turn down that request to delete the data, because it might be, I don't know, if it's payroll, for example, you have a legal obligation to hold that data. You can't anonymize payroll data until after the period that HMRC say you can, because they might need it to make sure you're paying the right tax and national insurance for that employee. So you do need to make sure you've got that in place. You do need to have procedures for dealing with those data subject rights, and you need to set up a process for handling those data subject access requests, because you should be fulfilling those data subject access requests within 30 days of. It used to be 30 days of the request. Now it's not 30 days of the request anymore. It's 30 days of when you verified that that person is who they say they are. And you should always verify that the person is who they say they are before you before you release data under data subject access request, because otherwise you've self-generated yourself a data breach, and you don't want that. But sometimes that can be complicated, because the most complex one I had of that was someone who requested information from a business, but they themselves were currently doing time in one of His Majesty's prisons, and they were illiterate. So they couldn't provide a utility bill because they were in prison, so they couldn't prove their address. And their signature was an X. And I don't know about you, but to me, one X looks much like another. And so it actually became really difficult. We ended up having to get a letter from the governor of the prison to confirm that that person was indeed that person, and they were currently in that prison. So it can be complex establishing someone's identity, but hopefully 99% of the time it's not that difficult. And as I say, you need to maintain your register of processing activities, your Article 30 register, so that you maintain that register. And it's important that you update that too, because I go into too many organisations, I think, where if I don't just talk about GDPR, I say, have you had your GDPR training? Yeah, we did that back in 2018. Yeah, 6 years on now. And the example I always give there to people is, you really ought to have a refresher. After all, if you were buying a used car from me and I couldn't produce MOT certificates for the last 6 years, you probably wouldn't be convinced that that car's roadworthy. Same's true with GDPR. You should be having that regular review of your processes, and also you should be having regular training of your staff. I'm not going to say go OTT on that. I'm not going to say train your staff every 6 months, but train your staff once a year, or at least once every 3 years. Don't leave it like 6 years, because typically it's out of date. And also, if you are a really big organisation, and I work with 2 FTSE 100 companies, one of those, maintaining their record of processing activities is almost a full-time task, because across the business, activities are changing all the time. And so they're having to constantly update that record of processing activities. The other thing, by the way, I would say with registered processing activities is, my personal view is, always update it, update the version number, but keep the previous ones, so you know what you used to do. Because if you have a data subject access request and you're now, for instance, I don't know, let's say you're now only keeping data for 3 years, but you used to keep it for 10 years, then you need to know you used to keep it for 10 years because, then you can find where the data is. But week 3 rather, is all about the paperwork. And by the end of this week, your GDPR paperwork should be well underway. And then week 4, although week 4 is actually ongoing week 4, really, a recurring week 4, is conduct regular GDPR audits. If you don't know, as I said right at the beginning, if you don't know what you've got, you don't know where you are. And you don't know what you need to improve on. So do conduct regular GDPR audits, whether you do those in-house or whether you get someone like myself to come in and do it for you. But do carry out those audits. Do make sure you've got data breach response procedures. What would you do if you had a data breach? And then a data breach can be someone hacking into your system. That's what people tend to think of when they think of data breaches. But it might not be that. It might be, one of your salesmen has left their laptop on the train. All these things are data breaches. So how do you deal with them? And it's important that you do have a way of dealing with them, and you've got documentation to deal with that. And the other thing I always say to people with data breach procedures is test them. You don't want to find the one time that your data breach procedure doesn't work is when you've just had a major data breach. That's not a nice position to be. So, test it, make sure it works. As I say, you should assign someone within your organization to be the data protection lead and monitor compliance and update processes as needed. So, conclusion and next steps. In just 30 days, you can go from GDPR chaos to GDPR confidence. Compliance isn't just a legal requirement, it's a trust-building opportunity. Use GDPR as a competitive advantage to show customers that you value their privacy. If you need any help with that, obviously, then, have a chat with us. I'm always happy to do a free GDPR consultation to see where you're at. Let's make compliance simple, manageable, and even fun. Because, it is that important. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And if anyone's got any questions, I will happily take any questions. And welcome into the room, Joe Mystery and Carly. By the way, you came in during the start of the presentation. Anyone have any questions for me? Joe.
Not at all, Keith. I think that was a brilliant summary of how you can approach data protection compliance, and you've clearly shown that it's kind of not just having the privacy policy or one aspect of it. So I thought that was a really brilliant summary there.
Thank you. Joe or Carly, any questions?
Oh, no questions from me. Just apologies for being late. I had some connectivity issues at the beginning.
That's okay, Carly. No problem at all.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, well, in which case, thank you everybody for coming along. I hope you found that useful. The replay will be being sent out to you as always. If you have any queries from the replay, of course, please do get in touch. And as I say, if you'd like me to have an informal chat with you and see if we can help you with your GDPR, of course, I'd be more than happy to do that. So, thank you, everyone. Can you stop recording, please, Dorcas?
Nice to see you, Keith. I'm going to drop off now.
Yeah, no problem, Joe. Great to see you too, and I hope everything goes okay.
Okay, great. And look forward to catching up soon.
Will do.
All right, see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Joe. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Bye.
Bye.
It's recording from your end, Keith.
Sorry?
The recording is from your end.
Yeah. That went really well. Pleased with that. And
No,
got
you
some,
have to stop it. I sent a request. It's recording from your end.
and got some good feedback too. So yeah.
Yeah. Keith, can you stop the recording? It's recording from your end, not mine.
Oh right,
You're the
okay.
host.
Let me try and